Okay, so please interrupt so we can sort of weave this last talk into a discussion. So no need to save the questions, just shoot. So the core idea, hi. There are no handouts, by the way, just the slides. So the core idea, what I want to do is talk about obviously this range of meanings that superparticles have. So I'll tell you what superparticles are. There are particles that are super in the sense that, you know, they do conjunction and quantification and free choice and NPIs and additivity, right? One particle, and we're assuming it's not homophony. I'll go through it, but it's really this one particle that is able to do that, right? You know, Chiara, she called it multifunctionality. Some people call it polysemy. We're not sure. Maybe it's allosemy. You know, I think it's maybe great tool or topics for a discussion. And obviously the question of how that changes, how that range of meaning changes. And empirically, I look at Indo-European and Japonic, and Chinese. I look at archaic Chinese, and progressively, luckily, we're running out of time because I haven't done that much on Chinese, but there are some interesting things there. Before we go on, how about we just talk about conjunction generally, and what kind of a space, what kind of variation we expect in expressions of conjunction. So we could do this kind of a Roberts kind of parametric questions. You ask a question, gives you a yes or a no, and if you get a yes, you ask more questions. So we could ask, first of all, is coordination lexicalized? Not conjunction, coordination generally, right? Well, if it's a no, then you get a language like Middle Egyptian. I've done a bit of Middle Egyptian, and there's just no word for that. John Mary could be John or Mary, could be John and Mary, we don't know. And Walsh, in fact, the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures identifies 6 languages to be of that type. So it's interesting, something we perhaps wouldn't expect. And then the next question you could ask is the contrast between conjunction and disjunction lexicalized? It could be a no. And that's the great work by Walpurgis, right, by Margaret Bolo. And in fact, it's been shown to be the case for ASL as well. But if it is lexicalized, then we can ask, well, we have 2 sub-questions, right? So actually the questions that I'm very interested in, to do with categoriality, right? So is disjunction sensitive to categorial contrast? That's funny. I don't think there is a conjunction that's sensitive to categorial contrast.
What does it exactly mean that disjunction is sensitive to categorical
Good point.
contrast?
Something in sentence level versus argument level coordination. Right?
For disjunctions.
For disjunction specifically. So John or Mary, that or being different from John likes fish or Mary likes meat. Right? Because we do have that. I will come back to that. But let's ask whether conjunction is... Sorry, go on, yeah.
I thought that, you know, so that in both Korean and Japanese, you have both these little particles that are conjunctive, disjunctive, and then there are these, you know, kuliko in Korean and God, what is it? Whatever is in Japanese. So then there are these complex constructions and these sentential conjunctions, where disjunctions can only be with these big things in the middle. So in that sense, they are...
Good point. Yeah.
There's something similar in Latin where you have like one disjunction that's derived from negation and something else, and it depends like its sentence level.
How big it is. Okay, interesting. Okay, so I like saying things out loud just so I can get a response. So this is too strong, right? But at the same time, I think it's find fewer languages that have noun level disjunctions, because disjunction seems to be inherently quite a causal thing. Excuse me. Whereas conjunction, on the other hand, is not, right? You can have the difference between nominal versus verbal conjunction. And in fact, if you have a language that dedicates a particular morpheme for nominal conjunction, it's very likely that that morpheme for nominal conjunction in that language is also a quantifier, or a morpheme that builds quantifiers or quantification expressions, like NPIs, free choice items, additives, who knows, right? And in fact, what seems to be the case in Indo-European, as I'll very quickly show, is that the old Indo-European had a contrast, and then it lost it. Okay, so so diachronically, it had a contrast and it lost it. So maybe que versus et in Latin, one dies out, et survives. Right? So, and in Japanese, what's interesting, or Japonic, let's say, we don't know about it all, but we know a yes develops. In old Japanese, you don't have a dedicated nominal coordinator and a dedicated sentential coordinator. They develop into each other in a way. Okay. And then we can ask different parameters, right? So this is more syntactic and it shouldn't be too relevant, but essentially it's about John, Mary, and Bill versus John and Mary, comma, Bill. And there's Tibetan and Amharic that do that, just the inverse. They don't express the penultimate conjunction marker, but the pen initial. Hopefully whatever theory we have about the structure for coordination, it should give us the parametric option to yield the two types of languages. Okay. So this nominal level conjunction, I call it mu. It could be a quantified particle, a superparticle. I think today we need to agree on a term. I'm happy to call it quantified particle. But these are the nominal level conjunctions that build all of these kinds of expressions, logical expressions. So the two series, very quickly, I think this is something we all know. So Bill more Mary more, both Bill and Mary. The inverse or the obverse of that would be Bill ka America, either Bill or Mary. Now if we just have one argument, not a binary structure, but just Mary more, it's an additive, also Mary. So the idea is that also Bill, also Mary together mean Bill and Mary. And again, this goes back to perhaps the categorical contrast between disjunction. In disjunction systems, you can't have Mary ka. I wonder what that would mean. So a noun combined with a ka morpheme. It usually attaches to an entire proposition. This is a very minimal proposition, but it's a full S to T. It's a sentence, a statement, an assertion, add ka to it, and it turns it into a polar question.
Or only very specific WH words.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, but I'm treating those. Yeah, good point. Yeah, and speaking of WH, an indeterminate pronoun combined with more, who, whatever, gives you everyone or anyone. An indeterminate pronoun combined with ka gives you someone, or anyone, in fact, as well. And this is one of the questions. These are, in a way, similar, right? I'm not going back to the discussion whether NPIs are universal or existential. I'm treating them as existential. But if they are existential, then the switch between a universal and an existential is no longer trivial. Although under negation they have similar inferences. Right? So the question is, which one came first? And that's one of the questions we want to answer. We're going to be talking about this series. So we know from Gill, at least, I think it's 6 or 5, anyway, in his Walls entry that if you look at the statistics, it's 67% of world's languages that do this kind of a thing, at least a fraction of this. So English, the fact that English doesn't do it is, English is an exception. It's not that Japanese is an exceptionally fashionable language. So there's something going on, right? that cross-linguistic semantics should uncover, and once we do that, I think in parallel we need to also understand the diachronic mechanisms. And I'm assuming that they're not homophonous. Right? So all these mors and all these cars, they're not different entries that happen to sound the same, they are the same morpheme. It happens to have different semantic incarnations depending on context, depending on syntactically on the complement. If it's a WH term, it'll do a particular thing. If it's a CP, it'll do. If it's a sentence, it'll do different things. And again, it's something perhaps definitely that is worth discussing. How do we deal with anti-homophony? Is it allosemy? Is it polysemy? Is it? And if it's 67% of world's languages, then why would languages consistently make that mistake if it is an accident? Right? Homophony in a way could be because a reading of homophony is accident, right? It happens to sound the same. But why does it happen to sound the same as 67% of world's languages? right? And then there's another argument, namely you can't reduplicate them. So if you say dono gakusei dono sensei mo hanashita, that means every student and every teacher talked. So which student more? So every student and every teacher, but you get the conjunction for free. The meaning, this can never mean every student or every teacher talked. But under homophony analysis, we'd assume that we have to reduplicate them. One more to form a universal, and one more to do the additive, right? Like Marimo, also Marimo. But this one's out, right? You don't reduplicate. Of course, it could be haplology or sure. Okay, so that was Japanese. So now let's look at Indo-European quickly, because Indo-European can show us how the structure actually looks like underlyingly. That maybe there are morphemes, silent morphemes in Japanese. If they're identical to the structures in Indo-European, then Indo-European might, and in fact it does, realize phonetically those morphemes. And that will help us understand Japanese better in a way. That's sort of the logic. I'm not assuming everyone's an Indo-Europeanist, but it's just one of the few facts we know about Indo-European syntax is that it had what's known as, it operated the Bakunaga law, right, the second position thing. So there were these particles that had to be in second position, and conjunction particles were one of them. So I'll show you very quickly two different pairs of examples. One will be a second position example, and the other, so apart from the second position particle that Indo-European had, it also had a non-second position particle. Right? So it had two ways of expressing conjunction. And I'll show you diachronically, it's only the non-second position one that wins. So again, thinking of Latin, arma virumque, right? And arma et virum, right? It's the et that wins, like in modern Italian and even English and so on, as opposed to her, like in noch. You get und. Here's a nice, sexy picture of Indo-European area with very small font, but essentially just the first instantiation of each of the languages and where the languages are spoken. So let's start with quickly Latin, and we're not going to say too much because Chiara's in the room, as well as some very scary philologists. So so I could say et, but I'm looking at atque. Something atque, something else, like English. And then you have this viam samutem que, right? But this que should be interpreted here, right? One and the other, not one other and. Same thing in Sanskrit. This is Vedic, so uta is like atque in a way. XP, uta, YP. And you can have via English cha. This is where typography goes wrong. But again, this cha is interpreted here. It's via vayu and indra, but one moves indra into the coordinated position, so you end up with it seems to be a head final coordinated position, but it's second position, right? It's second position with respect to the internal conjunct. Okay, same in Gothic, yach versus yach is like et, is like que. And the point here is, although we've been looking at syntax, the point is that the B series, so this should have been the other way around, so this is the second position on the A, right? This one dies out, yach sort of wins out. This yach can mean only and, whereas means more than and. And what we find is that, for instance, Latin atque, Sanskrit uta, Gothic yach, all these first position morphemes have two morphemes within them. And the idea is that the second morpheme is this superparticle, this particle that can mean more than and. Okay. So what do we expect then? If it is a superparticle, then it should sort of behave like Japanese, right? In the sense that it should have the daremo, the additive meaning, the universal meaning, the FCI, NPI, that kind of quantification and flavor to the meaning. And it sort of does. Again, something from Sanskrit, kimcha, what, combined with que, or again, calling it mu, and you end up with a free choice, kind of a universal free choice, whatever. Kascha, the negation, annual, right, and a nice NPI. Same with Latin, with quisque. In Latin, you can have quoque to do the additive. Gothic, the same with right? So, yeah, WH plus mu gives you universal free choice, or in fact, a distributive or universal. There we go. So what you've noticed, once I've gone through these and I've given you sort of bits and pieces of these meanings that these particular word level morphemes, namely the mu morphemes, cha, que, have. But I've said they can be NPIs, they can be free choice, but they can also be universal distributive terms, right? But for instance, in Sanskrit, kascha can never be a universal distributive term. In Gothic, kvazur can never be an NPI. This goes back to when I was saying about Japanese. Daremo can mean everyone or anyone. And these, once we look at it, these are sort of obverse meanings. And what seems to be the case in Indo-European languages make a choice whether they behave like an NPI, their WH plus mu behaves like an NPI, or it behaves like a universal. So the question is, what is it? That makes the choice, and which one was first, right, historically? And was one born from the other? So these are the two groups. I'm going to call one the universal group and one the negative polarity group, right? The existential group and the universal. Right? Does that make sense with respect to the languages? Okay. And okay, here's a nice table with some orange in it. So these are the mu markers in different languages. As you'll see, Slavic doesn't have a hyphen in front of it. Slavic E is not a second position clitic. It's one of the rare ones that doesn't require second position effects. And it's one of the rare ones that still retains the superparticle meaning of E. In fact, I argue elsewhere that semantic change is in fact conditioned by very boring factors such as linearization. So you can think, just like the neck analysis, right? After you move things to, like neck where neck, it becomes reanalyzed as a single morpheme, and then you lose the intricate structure. Okay. So, but the point is really have the Slavic and Indo Aryan kind of group that where mu marker combined with a WH term forms NPIs, and sort of the other group that forms universal distributive terms. Just a brief sketch of how we could do this. We started at 25, is that correct? Which means I should be finishing. Yeah, okay. So the idea is this que, this original que, in Indo-European that we can reconstruct. I'm just using que as a representative. It doesn't mean it has to be the que morpheme. It can be other morphemes, but a mu morpheme probably started out as a quantificational marker and then developed either into a pronoun or a conjunction marker. We can talk about the directions into which... we can talk about this. Let me just briefly give you some facts from Japanese and maybe Chinese very quickly, I think. So what we propose when I said atque is at plus que, I'm saying that this is the independent mu p that can do quantificational meanings. But once a junction phrase is there, think of it as a conjunction, if you will. This is the at and this is the que. And with reanalysis, these two just get lumped together. So structurally, there's no way to express a mu p meaning, namely a universal distributive, if you don't have a mu p, because you lose it by virtue of fossilizing the two functional heads into one, which then becomes simply a conjunction marker. And the biomorphemic facts are born out of this, but I'm assuming as Anna did, and Ben, and Chiara, in fact everyone here assumes it, this junction phrase, it's sort of void of conjunction, disjunction meaning, there's no contrast. The only job it really does is joins things together. And the job, the choice between con and disjunction is encoded in the actual mu p, in a way. Okay. This is supposed to be a tree, it just shows how the second position effect was lost. Here's a graph. Have a new software. Just shows that te got lost and chi in Greek won over, and this can be replicated for every other family, in fact, most families. So that was the Indo-European, right? So we still don't know which one was first, whether the distributive group came first or the NPI group, in a way. What was the original meaning of WH plus mu? Was it each one or no? No. So the question is, Daremo. What was the Daremo like 1200 years ago? What did that sound like? Well, in fact, it didn't exist. Daremo didn't exist because dare, as meaning who, is not scalar. And in Old Japanese, more can only combine with things that have a clearly scalar domain. Namely, with only two types of WH pronouns. One is when, the domain of intervals or time, and the other one is how much, or how many. Right, so it has an inherent, what seems to be, let me just show you, sort of, there are 24 occurrences of WH more, and both of them are scalar. I think this is the pattern that falls out. You don't have what, how, who, and so on. Just the things with what I think are inherently scalar domains. And then a couple of changes happen. One is in classical Japanese, you get the rise of polarity, and you get the loss of the restriction on scalar complements. So dare comes in. Dare denotes individuals, whereas how many denotes entailed intervals of quantities, or something like that. So once that kicks in, that can mean obviously everybody. Nani kicks in, but under negation, polarity occurs. So originally, I forgot to mention, in Old Japanese, there's more never encoded negative polarity. So what we find in Japanese is that you start with the universal term, universal distributive, and through time, that weakens, as it were, into a negative polarity expression. What we find in Japanese, what is interesting, is that you start not only with universal terms, but those terms are built from scalar terms, scalar WH terms. And in fact, this is sort of predicted under Gianollo approach, because scalar terms only have a sigma alternative available. And once you negate that, you only get a scalar implicature. You can't get a negative polarity effect. So I can go through tools. Let me just briefly tell you about what happens in Chinese before I finish. So this is the change we also observe in the mu system. So kappa actually changes much later than mu. So in Old Japanese, you don't get the additive, actually you get the even meaning. I think there's one or two examples where you can have the non-scalar additivity also. So this should be classical. Yeah, and in classical, then you have negative polarity kicking in, as well as full conjunction, because that's what we expect. Right? For additivity to occur, you need non-scalar complements. You need to be able to combine with things that are not necessarily scalar, because John is not scalar. You need to be able to first combine with non-scalar terms, and once you have that, you can derive additivity. Once you can derive additivity, conjunction comes for free. And you also marry, also give you billing. I think I'll stop here, but just to give you a brief 30-second preview of archaic Chinese. So the particle there is jie, which is sort of a predecessor to do. There's some slight conjecture, but that etymologically that seems to be the case. And this jie, in fact, is what's funny about jie is it's an inherently distributive quantifier, and it can only quantify into subjects, not objects, for reasons that I don't think we understand. What's known as Hauptmeyer's generalization, and I've done a bit of work on this. In fact, using scholars and choice functions. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but who knows. And in fact, in later sort of classical Chinese, we do see that it can mark negative polarity. Yeah, it will not do any harm. So not harm G precedes it, when it seems to have a negative polarity reading there. And once it does this, in a way, in the same sort of time period, we find availability for G to do sort of distributive conjunction, both. But just another thing that I find interesting is that, namely, the difference between Old and Modern Chinese is also the rise that we find in Japanese is the type lifting in a way. So in Old Japanese, you're completely fine with saying people all. Whereas in modern Japanese and Chinese, you have to say dono, people, mo, or who. which boy, though, right? So the classify system kicks in after the availability of that. Okay, and this is sort of just a picture of where we sort of stand. So the idea is that if we just look Hittite and Sanskrit, we should maybe have two different diachronic points to just show that the shift is always generally from a minus to a plus. The question is, what is the nature of that change? I've gone a bit beyond, but thank you very much. I'll stop here. I guess now we can sit maybe in a circle and discuss.
Let me just point out, so in Mandarin, do only means even and not also, but in Cantonese it does mean also. And
that's a good point.
It seems that in Mandarin, yeah, it's do. So it's not a probably it's not a deep study that that do lacks Mandarin do lacks the additive
function, or it's lumped with the scalar association obligatorily.
But so otherwise it seems that Cantonese. The Cantonese version is the same thing as the Mandarin one, except it also is the additive interpretation, so it should be a deep result.
Yeah, but I think the biggest insight we have into this is your idea of maybe decomposing the way we derive additivity with that scalar layer being a layer on top rather than something primitive. And maybe the question of parameters, or whatever, how we choose to classify languages, have that structure to just have a combinatorial way of saying, do you have those two, do you have those two? Can you have scalar exhaustification, can you have scalar additivity, so total exhaustification plus the scalar core? And I think, at least for me, it's helpful to think about it in the terms that you propose. Dissecting and then seeing the best way for these facts to fall out, if the structure is the case, which we hope it is.
Maybe you should look at Slavic and sub-Slavic.
Historic or just?
I mean, yes.
Yeah. Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. You are in a good position.
I'm learning
in a better position than people who don't speak like any of the sub-Slavic languages.
Chiara.
I just went ahead. I had a couple of questions. So why would it be that only these level conjunctions end up working as also as quantification variables? Because then you're showing you have some type lifting going on there. So if there is some principled way of quantifying it.
I think it's. I think Shimoyama proposes that in fact more when it combines with something, it can. So the indeterminate pronoun like dono gakusemo, that functions as a type lifter for more to operate on. So in a way, what for instance I propose with Sauerland is that this, in a way, these are E-type quantifiers. Right? It's something to do with E, even if it combines with a common noun, it's Slavonic, for instance, to give additivity. The E to T type is still inherently E in a way. We're not talking about sentence level types. So your question is why? Why would it be? And so, and I know that there is some controversy on the size that alternatives okay. So some people argue that they are all propositions, so that they all project to a T level. I know your work, and I wonder what you think about that. That's a very, very good point, in fact. Anna knows when I was starting out my work, that was one of the things I was puzzled by. And I think traditionally or generally, alternatives are a proposition. That's the default. Right? I mean, there are these sort of hybrid approaches where you have local alternatives, and Ben and I talked about that. But I mean, for Gianollo, it's very important that alternatives be a proposition. I think it's a bigger question than I can answer.
But I think it's an important one.
Oh, very important.
Well, it's not. It doesn't undermine anything.
No, I agree.
It's just important to
Very good question.
To address in order to understand. I mean, if it is true that all it is, I think it's very interesting what you showed us. This cross-linguistic generalizations. That if you have the difference between clausal type conjunctions and nominal type conjunctions, the latter ones are going to be those giving you the possible.
That's right. Yeah.
So I wonder if this follows from something we're not.
Oh, I hope so. That would be a great thing. Yeah. Right now I don't see it, but I think the question of how we treat alternatives, I think that's a very almost orthogonal question. But we hope, as you say, hopefully it will fall out. Whatever the advancement on that side is, it should feed into this or clarify the empirical generalization.
I mean, the importance of things being propositional is partially connected to the inference patterns, right? I mean, it's not clear what would mean